Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Holger Wiese. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Durham University in the UK, where he also runs an EEG lab. He is mainly interested in face recognition and face perception. He investigates how we recognize familiar faces, how we learn new facial identities, why people are more accurate at remembering faces of their own ethnic and age groups, how we perceive age, sex, and attractiveness in unfamiliar faces, and how our knowledge about other people is structured in semantic memory. He is also interested in how these aspects of face and person perception change across the adult lifespan. So, Dr. Wiese, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Well, yes, that's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, great. So, my first question would be, since we're going to talk about face recognition today, starting from an evolutionary perspective and maybe perhaps phylogenetic one or something like that, why did face recognition evolve? Or to put it another way, what is the evolutionary function that face recognition fulfills?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't know too much about the evolutionary perspective about this, and I'm actually also not that much interested in it. I think recognizing individual other people is clearly an advantage for us. It's probably an advantage throughout the history of mankind, I assume, but I don't know why it evolved. What I do know is, or what is relatively clear, I think, is that it's an advantage for us to recognize other people because we can structure our interactions with other people if we know who they are, right? If we know who these people are that we're dealing with, we can predict likely actions that these people will take, and we can plan our own actions towards these people. So this is clearly an advantage. And it was probably also an advantage at earlier stages of history. And I assume this is why it evolved, actually.
Mm-hmm. And you study face recognition in people, or do you also extend it to other animal models, or do you get any inputs from that area?
No, I'm mostly interested. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I'm nearly exclusively interested in human face recognition, actually. There is, of course, a lot of work on face recognition in animals, in great apes, for instance, but this is not my area, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and in terms of how face recognition works and probably where it is placed in the brain, do you think that there's any specialized mental or brain module for face recognition or not?
Well, I mean, this is a very, very old question that is massively debated for decades now, right? I mean, this whole idea that there might be a brain area that is specialized for faces, meaning that it processes faces and nothing else, is an idea that came up actually when the first cases of prosopagnosia were documented. So people who are face blind, people who after a brain injury have problems recognizing faces, even though other visual functions are largely intact. It became again interesting for researchers with functional brain imaging, and well, it is a debate that is going on for decades, and I don't think there is really a solution for this question, whether there is really a clear answer to this question. What we do know is that there are areas in the brain that are highly sensitive to faces, right? That respond very, very strongly whenever a face is presented. Whether you can come up with something else that will also trigger these regions is a slightly, to me, this is a slightly less interesting question. Other people are highly interested in that, of course. I'm mostly interested in how this process actually works. Including which brain areas are involved in that process. But to me, it's not the most important aspect. whether there is something in the brain that only deals with faces and with nothing else, if that makes sense.
Yes, so in terms of the mechanism itself, or in terms of, yes, in terms of the mechanism, you are interested more in how it works than, for example, in the specific brain areas that are behind it, or if there is a single one that is
Yeah.
specialized in face recognition. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, that is correct. I mean, I am interested in the brain areas that are processing faces, but to me, it's not the most important question whether you can actually use these brain areas also for something else. Um, so there are areas in the human brain, in the ventral visual stream, in the lower temporal lobe, in the so-called fusiform gyrus, that are highly sensitive to faces, that respond to faces and don't respond to many other visual objects, like, I don't know, pictures of houses or pictures of cars or something like that. Um, Whether you can actually find other object categories, if you are really, really interested in that, that might also trigger that region, is to me not the most critical question. The question is that it is clear that there are regions in the brain that are really highly sensitive to faces, and that shows that the face is a very, very critical and very important stimulus for us.
Yeah, and as neuroscience works nowadays, I guess we could say that probably the best way to put the question wouldn't be to ask if there's a single area in the brain that is specialized for face recognition, but rather that it will probably be a neural network of several different areas, right?
Yes, yes, definitely. There is definitely more than one area in the brain that responds to faces. People kind of I'm slightly disagreeing on whether there are specific areas that have specific subfunctions, right? So there is a classic view of face recognition that there is one region in the fusiform gyrus, for instance, that is more related or more interested in invariant aspects in faces, so things that don't change from one second to the next, like the identity of a person. Whereas other regions in the brain, in the superior part of the temporal lobe, are more interested in quickly changing aspects like emotional expressions or lip movements during speech. And it's definitely not just one area that deals with information from faces. Yes.
Yeah. And what kind of information can people get just by looking at another person's face? I mean, what kind of information about, for example, their sex, their age, their personality, and things like that, can they get from a face?
Well, there are some things that are relatively easy for us to perceive in faces, right? We are, under normal circumstances, we are very accurate if we have to judge the sex of a person from the face, or if we know a person very well, it's probably easy to identify that person from a face. We are very good at interpreting emotional expressions in the faces of others. We can say something about the relative age, maybe not the exact year, but we can say whether somebody is a child or an adult person, or a younger or an older adult person. All these things are relatively easy for us. People often agree on personality characteristics. So when you see a face, when a face is perceived, there is a considerable agreement whether that person looks trustworthy, for instance. Whether this is actually true is a different question, right? Whether this is actually an accurate judgment, that's a different question. And actually, most research about these not so easy to judge aspects in faces is about whether people agree in their judgments. And there is considerable agreement, yes. So people tend to make these judgments. Whether they're accurate is a different question.
So it's a little bit like the research on stereotypes. I mean, people hold stereotypes about different groups of people, and they might be more or less correct or accurate, right? And we have to look into that on an individual basis or on a case by case basis, right?
Yeah, maybe it is related to that. There are some examples actually from relatively old literature from the 1930s, 1940s, from the United States, where people were asked to make judgments about yearbook photos, for instance, about a person's intelligence. There were actually IQ tests for the people that were depicted in the images. And from that research, what was found is that people kind of agree on which people, or which photos, I should say photos, looked more intelligent versus maybe slightly less intelligent. So people agreed on that, but there was actually no correlation with actual IQ, right? So there are cases like this in which although we seem to agree that there is actually not really a strong basis for our judgments, or for the accuracy of our judgments, actually.
Mm-hmm. But if people are able to recognize these different traits of other people, like age, gender, personality traits, and so on, but they are not 100% accurate, and sometimes they may even be wrong, this works like a sort of heuristic process, right? I mean, the kinds of mechanisms that the brain uses to make these distinctions and identify these traits.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean, right? I mean, for age and gender, for instance, there are really clear physical cues in the face, and people learn how to use them, and then they are highly accurate, and they really rarely make mistakes with that. With these other personality traits, I guess it's a bit more difficult, also because we don't get good feedback in many cases, right? So we make a judgment, then we think a person might be particularly trustworthy or not, and once we made this decision, that will bias everything, all the information that we process from that point on, I guess. So this is a bit more tricky. And one other aspect about this, which is often overlooked in this kind of research, is that these judgments highly depends on specific images. So you can probably have a number of different pictures of the same person, and the person will be rated by independent raters as more or less trustworthy depending on the specific image that you use, right? There's an interesting study that shows that for attractiveness, actually. So if you have 10 different people, and you have, I think, maybe 20 different images for each individual person, and you let participants rate each individual picture for attractiveness, what you see is that there is a massive overlap. Of course, there are individual differences between individuals, right? So some person is, on average, perceived as more attractive than another person. But at the same time, there is a massive overlap of how individual images are rated, right? So the worst image of the most attractive person is still in that sample was still less. It was, sorry, the worst image of the most attractive person was less attractive than the better images of the least attractive person on average, right? So there's a massive span, massive range. Mm-hmm. So we need to be a bit careful when we talk about this for both of these reasons, right? So first of all, these ratings depend on image characteristics quite a lot, and second of all, it is often what we often measure these studies often measure is how strongly people agree, and not how accurate these measures are objectively. Mm-hmm. These ratings are objectively.
Yeah, At a certain point there, if I'm not mistaken, you refer to the fact that for certain traits, like for example age and gender, that people learn how to distinguish, for example, a male from a female, and they are almost all the time correct on their judgment. So do we know at what age infants, for example, are able to distinguish between male and female faces?
I'm pretty sure that we are. I am not, I think. I don't know at exactly what age, at what age infants are able to do that, to be honest. I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know that.
No, I was just trying to, I asked you that because I was just trying to understand if it could also have some sort of innate component to it, instead of being just something that is 100% acquired or learned. So.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about that. But I mean, in psychology, I assume in most cases the answer is it's a little bit of both, right? There is, in most cases, face processing abilities and probably also judgments of gender are to some extent learned and to some extent maybe not. There might be some mechanism under it, but I'm speculating here. I don't know that really.
Okay, no problem. So another question, what is face familiarity? What is this concept about, and are we biased toward remembering familiar faces better than others?
Well, familiarity, I assume, means that we can actually recognize the identity of a person, right? If we're familiar with somebody and we see the face, we can actually say who that person is. And there is a sequence of steps that brings us from perceiving the picture or the person in real life to, I don't know, generating information about that person, maybe the name or something like that. There's a sequence of steps in between. Familiarity, I would say you are familiar with a person and you really know what a person looks like if you're able to recognize that person from a picture you've never seen before, right? So there is a clear difference. There's lots of research now about this, that it can be actually quite difficult to recognize unfamiliar people from novel images. So if you just meet somebody briefly, and then you have to recognize that person from a completely new picture that you've never seen before. This can be very tricky. It can be even tricky to match images of unfamiliar people, right? So if you have two different pictures of the same person, it can be very hard to see that it is actually the same person, because images can look very, very different. And at the same time, these tasks are absolutely no problem, usually very, very easy if you are familiar with a person, right? So if you imagine that I show you two pictures of a good friend of yours, you would have no problem at all to see that these two images show the same person. Or if I show you a picture of a good friend, a particular image that you've never seen before, you would have, in most cases, have no problem to say this is my friend X. So familiarity, I guess, means that you are able to recognize the identity of a person from a picture you've never seen before, right?
Yeah. And are there any facial traits that we know about that render faces or some faces more memorable than others? I mean, that if someone has those traits and another person looks at her for the first time or something like that, then she more easily remembers her face than someone who lacks those traits, for example.
Yes. Well, there's the idea of distinctiveness versus typicality in face recognition. So faces that somehow stand out, faces that somehow, I don't know, don't look like an average face, and we can discuss what that means in a second, are actually easier to remember and easier to recognize. So what I mean when I say an average face or a not average face, a distinct face, is that you probably the facial characteristics that we have, I don't know, the size of our nose, for example, or whatever, is probably kind of normally distributed, right? So some people have very small noses, some people have very big noses, most people are somewhere in the middle. Now, if you deviate from that average point in one or the other direction, and you do that on a number of traits, then your face is distinctive. Your face is not average. Yeah. And there is a good amount of research showing that people are better at remembering these very distinctive faces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but you haven't identified the set of particular facial traits that render faces more distinguishable or recognizable, or?
I mean, I think it does not really depend on what specific characteristic of a face we talk about. It is probably. It doesn't matter too much as long as it deviates from an average face, and if you are, it probably doesn't matter which specific aspect of the face it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about biases in face recognition. There are several of them, right? So starting with probably the own race bias. So people have that bias. They are able to recognize more easily or distinguish between people that are part of their own race more easily than others. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So it is a very common phenomenon, at least definitely in Western participants that we most often test, that it's easier for participants from Western countries to recognize or to remember individual faces from Western countries with a Western background relative to, for instance, let's say Eastern Asian faces. Yes, and there is considerable evidence that this is not about the faces per se. So if you, for instance, test Eastern Asian participants, they are better at remembering Eastern Asian faces relative to, let's say, European-looking faces. Yeah, this is a very well-known phenomenon that is, people look at this and do research about this for, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years. It's a very well-known phenomenon.
Yeah. And what about the own age bias? So this also happens with people that are close in age or something like that?
Yes, there is a similar phenomenon with age. So if we test, well, psychologists often test psychology students, so young adults, and what you can relatively easily demonstrate is that this participant group, young adults, are actually better at remembering the faces of other young adults relative to, for instance, older adults. It is a bit harder. So when we talked about the so-called own race bias, in many cases this is a more or less symmetric effect, right? So both participant groups, let's say Western European and Asian participants, where Eastern Asian participants are better with their own respective face group. The own age bias is a bit less symmetric. So it is very easy to, or relatively easy to demonstrate it in younger adults. It is not as easy to demonstrate it in older adults. And that is interesting because it might tell us something about the mechanism that is underlying. So what we usually use to explain the so-called on race bias is that people don't have enough experience, people don't have enough expertise, right? So we grow up in a specific setting, and what we do while we grow up is we learn to distinguish the faces that we see, right? So if we live in a country in which the large majority of faces is European-looking, then we will be very good at distinguishing between European-looking faces. And if then all of a sudden we meet people that look systematically different, we will have a problem with that. And that is one of the explanations for the so-called on race bias. With the on age bias, it's a bit more difficult because people accumulate experience over their lifetime with different age groups. So younger adults might not have a lot of contact with older adults, While on the other hand, older adults have been young during their life, in the course of their lifetime. So they might have this kind of long-term expertise for younger faces that they had gained at an earlier stage of their life. That would explain why they don't show a strong bias, actually, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And is there any other kind of own group, let's say, biases in face recognition apart from own race and own age biases?
Yes, there are other biases. There is a so-called own gender bias, for instance. So particularly female participants are better at remembering female than male faces. And that's an interesting one because it's not easy to explain that with experience. And there is also research coming out saying that there are all sorts of different biases. So if you just label faces randomly, that they belong to a specific social group, like belonging to your university versus a different university, etc., then some researchers claim people will be better at remembering faces from your own social group, even if it's a completely arbitrary label that you assign to these faces. So this is interesting because it challenges this kind of explanation that I just gave you for the own race bias, right? We say the own race bias is about experience. That might be the case, but we cannot explain, for instance, an own gender bias with experience, because most of us see male and female faces all the time, every day, and most of us grow up in circumstances where we are surrounded by both male and female faces. So experience is not a good explanation for that. And the alternative explanation that comes more from a social psychology perspective is that people might be differently motivated to process faces from their own social groups relative to a different social group. And this might be an explanation for these more social biases, let's say.
Yeah. And are there any factors, like, for example, the context, the circumstances, different kinds of situations or things that people learn or are exposed to that can modify these biases?
Yes, of course. So well, I mean, let's say we have two different factors that influence these biases. One is motivational, and one is about long-term expertise and long-term learning. So you can, of course, modify or modulate both of these factors, right? You can make people, if it's about motivation, you can make people somehow more motivated, and then they should be better at recognizing the faces, right? So you could actually reward them in a specific situation to recognize faces from a different group. And if it's about motivation, then this should help. But you can also modify the experience that people have, right? So if I go to a different country and live there for a long time, then I regularly interact with the people living in that country, then I will also learn to differentiate the faces that I see, right? And I will become better at differentiating the faces from that country. This is probably really a long-term effect. So these two different accounts, these two different ideas, whether it's about an expertise and long-term expertise or motivational effects, mostly differ in how quickly you can, in their predictions on how quickly you can change these biases, right? Yeah. A motivation might be easier to change than something that you learn over a long time during your life, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. And then there's another question here that we talked, for example, about the own age bias, but isn't it the case that older people, just by the process of getting older, with time and with age and cognitive aging, sometimes they might start getting some difficulties in terms of person or face recognition?
Yes, yes, they do get this. They do get difficulties. I mean, what people most complain about is probably name information, accessing name information. There are also other changes over the adult lifespan that you can actually measure in experiments. So people are less efficient with increasing age in face recognition, right? So face recognition is a very quick process that we usually, recognizing a familiar face is something that we usually do without spending any, without being aware of any effort. We do that very quickly, very efficiently. And in older adults, this even though older people are perfectly fine at recognizing highly familiar faces, it seems that it is less efficient. So it takes a little bit of more time. It probably also takes a little bit more processing resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that we can also include here another point that we haven't yet touched on, that is the relationship between face memory and semantic memory. That is also another topic of your work, right?
Yeah, it is, yes. So semantic memory in the sense of identity-specific semantics, right? So that means usually when we see a face, recognizing that we know that person is not enough, right? So we started from this idea that we need face recognition to plan interactions and to predict what the other person will do. It is not enough to recognize a face for that, right? So what we need in addition is we need to know who the person is. Why do we know the person? What are the personality traits of that person? What are the interests of that person? What are the motivations that this person might have? And all this is additional, mostly semantic information that we have stored somewhere in our brain that we need to access to plan an interaction with that person. And just because we were talking about aging, it seems that this kind of accessing semantic information is something that is really highly preserved in older adults, whereas these earlier, more perceptual processing stages, as I just said, are less efficient. It is that the visual system is working less efficiently, but accessing this kind of semantic information, once we have reached that stage, seems to be largely intact in older adults.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. So just to go back to a previous topic that we touched on, what are some of the traits that best distinguish female from male faces?
Well, I mean, there is good evidence now that faces are processed holistically. Which means that we don't process faces on the basis of individual features. So we cannot say we can distinguish male from female faces on the basis of the nose of the person or something like that. There are traits or there are characteristics in faces that are on average different between male and female faces, right? So males have broader chins on average and also more protuberant noses on average. But the variability is so high in individual faces that we cannot use a single feature or also a combination of 2, 3, 4 features to reliably distinguish between male and female faces. What we usually do is we process faces as wholes. We process the combination of all the aspects of a face. One interesting point is when we talk about distinguishing between male and female faces, there are two different types of information in faces. We can talk about shape and we can talk about surface properties of faces, right? So if you imagine a wide bust of a face, this is pure shape information, pure 3D shape, and people are quite good at distinguishing if you have stimuli like that don't have any color information, any changes in any patterns of brightness that change over the face, so just a white bust. People can use this stimulus to distinguish between male and female faces, but they are better if they have additional information coming from shading patterns over the face, for instance.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. And just to cover one last topic, talking about attractiveness, are there any objective traits of attractiveness or traits that people in general tend to associate with attractiveness in faces?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess that brings us back to the point, to a similar point that we had earlier. I mean, what do we mean when we say objective? There is certainly a large agreement among people which faces are attractive and which faces are less attractive. but we tend to underestimate individual taste, if you want, right? So there is a large agreement, but there are also individual differences in what people think is attractive and what is less attractive. In the attractiveness literature, people often say that average faces are very attractive. You probably heard about that, which is a bit counterintuitive, right? But if we think back about, we talked about that already. What we mean when we say average faces, it might make more sense. So if we say that facial characteristics are kind of normally distributed, like some people have very small noses, some people have very big noses, most people are somewhere in the middle. Some people have very longish faces, some people have broader faces, most people are somewhere in the middle. And if you are average on all of these characteristics, or on a lot of these characteristics, then your face will be perceived as relatively attractive. So this is one aspect of it. At the same time, there are aspects in faces that are often called sexual dimorphisms that are also perceived as highly attractive. So for instance, women with very full lips and very large eyes are often perceived as highly attractive, even though these particular traits are not average at all. Yeah. Right. So this is a bit difficult, right? So if a face is average, it is quite attractive, but probably highly attractive faces, very, very attractive faces, are not average. They have these particular on specific features. They systematically differ from an average face.
Mm-hmm. And aren't there traits like, for example, symmetry that are universally considered to be attractive because they serve as kind of a proxy to the fact that the person went through normal development or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yes, symmetric faces are perceived as attractive. Yes. This is actually also something that comes with averaging faces together, right? And with getting closer to this kind of average face, they will become more symmetric if you do that. So yes, symmetry in faces is perceived as attractive. Whether that is because it signals something like, I don't know, health or something like that, I don't know. I think these are actually questions that are usually quite difficult to answer experimentally, right? So there is a lot of speculation about these things. I think from my perspective, it is hard to test this empirically, as is the case with many questions that come from an, I don't know, let's say more evolutionary background. So I would be a bit careful about what we can actually say about this. But yes, symmetry is something that is considered attractive, yes.
Mm-hmm. So it's much easier to identify the traits that people consider to be attractive than to explain why it is like that or where it comes from, right?
Well, I mean, yes, I would say that. I would say yes, but this is not specific for attractiveness, right?
Sure.
This is probably also the case for many of the other things that we were talking about. Generally, I think you know, in many cases, arguing from an evolutionary perspective is in many cases a reasonable explanation for something, right? It kind of makes sense if we think about it, but it's actually from a scientific perspective, I think it's a bit difficult sometimes because it's hard to test. There might be other also also perfectly reasonable explanations, and we have a hard time distinguishing between them experimentally. So in that sense, I think you're right. It's easier to identify the specific factors that make a face, in that case, attractive relatively to finding out why that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my last question will be, and going back to something that I asked on a broader context, let's say, are attractive faces more memorable than unattractive ones?
That's a bit a tricky one. So So faces that are very distinctive are easy to remember, right? We said that earlier. And so these highly attractive faces, let's say female faces with very big eyes, very full lips, etc., that are distinctive, these faces are probably relatively easy to remember. When we go to this idea that attractive faces are also kind of average, then this changes, right? Because if all your features are kind of like everybody else's features, and the only thing that makes you attractive is that you have all of them actually quite on the average, then it becomes different, and these kind of average faces, these kind of more typical faces, are actually probably harder to remember, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a bit difficult. Probably attractiveness per se is not the relevant factor here. The relevant factor is the face distinctive or not, right? Mm-hmm. And you can have very distinctive faces that are also attractive, but you can also have but average faces are also quite attractive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a tricky question, right?
It is a tricky question, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Wiese, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work if they're interested?
I have a website, yes. It's wieselab.com. You can also look me up at the university website, so Psychology Department of Durham University in the UK. This is where you can find information about me and about my work, yes.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to that and also to the rest of your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out if they find it interesting.
That's
and
great.
Dr. Wiese, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to everyone.
Yes, great. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation again.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've already been doing this for more than 2 years now, and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I really need your help to keep this channel sustainable. It's really an urgent matter now. So please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, or go to any of my monthly subscription PayPal links in the description box of the interview, or even to my main link on PayPal to make a big donation, a one-time big donation or several times big donations, whatever you prefer. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull. My producers is Web, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Elewin Osborne, Dr. Ian Gilligan, and Sergio Codriano. And my executive producer, Michel Rugieski. Thank you for all.